Hey, super awesome listeners. This week, Jen wanted to share with you episode 1 of season 2 of The Battle, where this season, Jen and I are diving into the world of true crime to determine the best song inspired by true crimes and criminals. Each week that a song advances, you'll learn more about that crime or criminal, and we'll have some bonus content so you hear the rest of the stories. Enjoy, rate, review, subscribe, and share with your friends. And Jen will be back next week with a brand new episode of What Are You Listening To? Welcome to The Battle. I'm Matt Sidhom, and this season, Jenn Tully and I will try to delve into the world of true crime and determine the winner of the true crime-inspired song battle. We've got 16 songs, all inspired by actual crimes that have been committed either here in the United States or somewhere else around the world. This week, we have the serial killer division, starting in the U.S. with Deep Red Bells by Neko Case, taking on the Shankill Butchers by the Decemberists. Jen, you took a deep dive into the Shankill Butchers, so why don't we start there and talk about this song by the Decemberists?
All right. So I think that, this series of The Battle is either going to make some people incredibly delighted because they are true crime fans and they already knew what these songs were about and they're excited to get into the details, or they knew it was about a true crime but don't have a lot of information. And then there's going to be the other half of people that thought this was such a bop. And now we've ruined their day with the true story behind the song. That was like every alt J song ever for me. I'm singing along thinking things are great, and then yikes.
They're not so great. They're not so great.
It's kind of sad. Yeah, there's some crazy things happening around the world here. So yes, Shankill Butchers by the Decemberists. This is from their Crane Wife album from 2006, which was a really big album for this band. And I think something interesting about all of the songs that we've chosen for this division is that none of these songs sound overtly like they're about murder or crime or serial killers. And I think that this one really fits into that, especially if you're a Decemberist fan. It has that same kind of raw, dialed down sound. I think Decemberists fall into the category for me of an Iron and Wine, and just very mellow and calm. And it really does, you start getting into this song a little bit more, and you do start to hear a little bit of the death march in it. It does start to sound a little bit like that. But top line, Shankill Butchers is a story about these sort of just rogue gang members that were part of the UVF, which is the Ulster Loyalist Parliamentary Gang. So for any of you Irish folks out there, or people that are fans of stories or movies or music about the Troubles, which was a time in Ireland, about a 30-year period where it was a mini war is probably not the correct geopolitical term, but certainly it was a dangerous time. I mean, there's no way around it. There's a lot that's been written and sung about the Troubles in Ireland, and this is another example of that. It was really...
And Jen, I'll just say there, that's something that I remember, even growing up in the 80s, where there's not this 24-hour news cycle or the internet to really dial you in on things. I mean, it was something I think we regularly heard about here.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Just to kind of emphasize the magnitude of it, because I don't know, now you can do a Google search and you can read up whatever you want about it, right? But I think so many international things maybe were lost here in the U.S. because you had 30 minutes of news a night, right? It just wasn't as pervasive. And so for me, that time really stood out in my mind as oh no, that was a real thing. So I just want to kind of chime in on that even without doing any research here, if you grew up of that time, you were probably familiar with what was going on.
Yeah, you heard of the Troubles. And again, another thing is there are so many Irish immigrants in America, right? That pride, Irish pride is a real thing as I'm sitting here with my red hair and my last name of Tully. And so we were always told about the Troubles, right? Like that was something that was like a cautionary tale of, what can go wrong. The other thing that I think is interesting about this particular version or story of the Troubles, and of course, there are many songs. Sunday Bloody Sunday comes to mind, the U2 song, obviously also about the Troubles. That this song is, it's a much more, I don't want to say, I feel like it's less like Sunday Bloody Sunday. You can tell they're an Irish band. They are angry about what happened. This is a dialed back version of that. I'm not saying they're not angry about this story, but it's so sombering the way that it's sung, and it's the cadence of the song is so much that, like I said, it feels almost like it's this remembrance or this death march version of the story. And, this gang was pretty brutal. They were notorious for kidnapping, torturing, and murdering random people just because they were suspected Catholic civilians. So I think that another thing that's interesting about sort of this song and this story versus some of the others is this is the only one you'll find in this division that was kind of politically or religiously motivated, right? The rest of the stories that we're going to get into were basically, your run of the mill psychopath, like your basic nightmare that you warn your kids about. But this was like a political movement that sort of bred this kind of brutality. And I thought that that was something that was kind of interesting about this song in particular versus some of the others that we'll discuss in this season of the battle.
Well, and while some of the other like crimes we'll talk about were hidden, as often crimes are, right? Hidden until they're discovered. This was stuff that kind of happened a lot of times pretty publicly.
Oh, yeah, yeah, very much. And, I think that most people are familiar with the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. And I feel like the interesting thing about this, too, was because it was the UVF, it's a little bit different version of that story. And so I appreciated that about this song and how it sort of shed light on all sides of a conflict, right? I think we can look around the world today even and see that there are lots of sides to every conflict that's going on. And so this one really sort of drove that home. And again, the Irish have a knack for a certain brand of brutality here that, is really pretty shocking. In total, I believe they killed around 22 people aged 7 to 55. Only one of their victims survived his injuries. They did everything from mass shootings in a bottling plant to beating people to death, to drive-by shootings, to shooting two folks while they were sitting in their trucks that they believed to be on the wrong side of the fence, if you will. They had bomb attacks. They poisoned people. I mean, these were not subtle crimes, like you mentioned. They really were trying to prove a point. And I think that it's really interesting that, of all the things that have been made about the Troubles, this one is a different story to me. This one felt like new information, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with the song, and obviously, like I said, I was a little bit familiar with, the Troubles, but it's a song that once you put it in that context, you're right, you do start to get a feel of like that death march and that sort of marching tune that goes along with it, and the starkness of the recording really stood out to me, right? And just sort of it kind of put me a little bit on edge, which I imagine if you were living there at that time, you would have been on edge, especially depending on what side you were on. I actually, it probably didn't matter what side you were on, right? It
Right.
was just you were just on edge at all times. And it's also fascinating to think about how that was a battle between Protestants and Catholics, right? It was not
Mhm.
sort of this, we see a lot of Muslims versus Jews and things like that in the Middle East. And like here, it's like, I mean, you think about in the US, a lot of people are just like, yeah, Protestants and Catholics, aren't they kind of the same thing, right? If you're
Right.
not all that familiar with religion, if you're not doing a deep dive, this is almost bewildering because they seem so much alike.
No, you're right. And I mean, of course, it's like all things, there are many layers to it. But yeah, the Ulster Irish were, and you see it now. I think it's so interesting that we're talking about this post Brexit, right? Where you have the UK and then you still have the Republic of Ireland as its own independent nation. Like those wounds run really deep. They brought people from Northern Ireland and Scotland down into the Republic of Ireland to be loyal to the crown, and that is kind of caused a lot of conflict actually, and still resonates today. This summer I had the good fortune of being back in Ireland, and there's still no love for the crown there. Like they still, all of these years later, we were in a cab on our way to the airport, and we got a very colorful Irish lesson in how our cab driver felt about current monarchy. All these years later, like it still runs really deep. So it was a civil war of sorts. Well, not even of sorts, it was. And I think that this is just a really an interesting telling of that sort of flips the traditional script, because it is focused on the Ulster side versus the Irish Republican Army side. And I think the story about how the song sort of came into the world. It's interesting to me that Colin Malloy, who's the lead singer of the Decemberists, likely an Irish fellow, I'm judging by the name, he was reading a biography about Van Morrison, and that's kind of where he first got into this. Van Morrison was writing in one of the chapters about the Troubles, obviously growing up, living through that time. And he was just really horrified by the brutality of this crime and kind of wrote it as like a cautionary tale. And that's something that we'll see, I think, throughout this season, in thinking about, do we want to talk about these songs with these terrible stories? And I think that that's part of it, right? You find that folks wrote about this not because of an increased interest in the macabre, but because it is a cautionary tale. It sort of falls under that category of like sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? And if we can talk about it, if we can remember the history, hopefully we won't repeat it.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we talk all the time just on all our podcasts about how much music helps with memory. And I think, you're spot on in saying that, and like in throwing that out there. It's like that's when you kind of dig in and learn about these stories. Think about on a much somewhat tamer level, a song like The Hurricane by Bob Dylan, right?
Yeah,
Which is just almost like a news report, right? Like it's just
right.
like a book report he put into song form. But at the time, no one knew this story, right? And so by kind of putting it out there, he was trying to just shed light to it. And even now, I'll play that song for younger people and be like, no, go research. Like this was a real thing that happened to somebody, And
Yeah.
obviously, we had the movie with Denzel Washington later, but up until that point, it was not a bigger public story. And I think that was the interesting thing in doing research for this season, how you learn about some of these things, and it's like, how is this? Did this really happen? Like this is amazing. Like it's really kind of shocking as you do research into some of these stories.
It's true. And again, I really, like, I know I said it before, but it really does give you it gives you perspective. It gives you a lot of different sides of the same story. You could listen to Sunday Bloody Sunday and then listen to Shankill Butchers, and you've kind of got, two different sides of the same story. And like I
Hmm.
said, there's been a lot written about, Sinn Fein and the IRA and things like that. But I felt like this was a really unique take because it did take the route of looking at the UVF. So that is, I think, where we'll leave it with Shankill Butchers, because we want to keep the listeners intrigued, but we can't give the whole story away just yet. So tell me about my competitor here today. I believe we're talking about a Neko Case song. Am I right?
Yes, this song is titled "Deep Red Bells" by Neko Case. Neko Case was born in 1970, okay, in Tacoma, Washington. And so, around the age of 10 until, all the way through her teen years, she was right there in Tacoma, which is near the Green River, which became famous at that time because it was during the reign of terror of who would later be dubbed the Green River Killer. And so she wrote this song about, kind of growing up in that area at that time, and sort of her childhood being overshadowed by the Green River Killer, who's known as Gary Ridgway. Um, and Ridgway's victims, so it's actually unclear how many victims he ultimately had, and that's kind of the really scary part. As I sort of delve into this, all his victims were female, and he had this awful childhood growing up. And the result of that childhood was that he was very violent against women, and would, in particular, most of his victims were women in vulnerable positions. So in particular, he would target prostitutes, but also like underage runaways. He would often take these women out into these wooded areas. He got the name Green River Killer because his first 5 victims were found in the Green River. He would often strangle his victims to death, which was like with his bare hands. So he would try to have sex with these women and then start to strangle them and eventually kill them. And I
I
haven't
think
even gotten to the disturbing part, Jen.
right. I know, right? That's the thing, is like you scratch the surface and then you're like, oh my gosh, these people were so messed up. But I think you said something really important. And another reason, like, I feel like some of these songs sort of were breathed into life is that uh, like violence begets violence, right? We've seen over and over in history. And like, I feel like some of the impetus for some of these songs has to be to try and break those cycles of violence by like speaking them out loud, right? Like, look, if you treat a child this way when they're growing up, like this is all that they know and this cycle continues, and so that seemed to be something to like a common thread between these artists that have written these songs and performed them, was that they really were using them as a cautionary tale. And it feels like that was kind of where Neko Case was coming from too, since this was a very real thing that was happening where she was growing up at the time. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. It was definitely, and I think from her perspective, there was almost this, it was this warning against, like just kind of a warning for all women. Like, think about it. Like, she is squarely in the age of
Yeah.
what we would later find out were a number of his victims. So I imagine this kind of resonated with her at the time in a way that it couldn't possibly resonate with someone between the ages of 16 and 20 now, right? Like
Right.
it's just it's not going to quite resonate the same way when it's like, this is where we live and this is happening to women. And granted, they're runaways or they're this or they're whatever, but I mean, it's remarkable how long this went on.
Oh
Like
yeah.
his first victim was around 1982, and it went for years and years after that. And they were finding evidence of his victims as recently as 2023.
Wow. Wow. I mean, that's crazy.
It is. And I said I hadn't even gotten to the worst part, which was he would often like dispose of his bodies in the woods, and he would come back to find those bodies, one, to see if they'd been discovered, right, because he was trying to cover his tracks in a way, but then sometimes he would engage in acts of necrophilia with the bodies.
Oh boy, this
He
guy's a
would,
special brand of crazy.
and he'd later claim it was to and I apologize for laughing, but it's just almost unbelievable. But it's like, part of it was it would satisfy him enough to where he would avoid going to get another victim, another live victim, and therefore delay him potentially getting caught. So getting caught seemingly was always in the back of his mind, right? Which will be interesting later if this continues on. We'll certainly finish. We're going to finish this story at some point, but that factor would come into play later on when he eventually does go to trial. But it just, I mean, from a crime standpoint, it was just awful, like hearing about this and just seeing how long it would go, and also kind of puts you, it was also shocking to think the technology was so antiquated back then that something like this could go on for such a long time without
Sure.
people knowing. And, like I said, when it came to the Troubles and the 24-hour news cycle, and like we still heard about that, it's like that's how big a thing it was. I'd heard of the Green River Killer, but I will say I didn't know nearly enough about him until kind of this deep dive. I'm sure, the true crime aficionados out there would kind of laugh at the fact that I haven't heard of the Green River Killer and knew everything about him. But yeah, just an awful, awful human being. But I thought it was a really interesting song because it does sound very haunting, but there's also this little kind of picks up with about 90 seconds left for about a minute that kind of turns into this upbeat sort of almost country sounding tune, and then it goes right back to its original rhythm. So just a really interesting song, but I think kind of does a good job of, knowing the context of how it was written. I think it does a good job of showing the emotion of what that must have been like. Because there probably
Yeah.
were fun times in her childhood, and then it would come crashing back to earth knowing that this killer was still out there.
No, I completely agree with you, and those were the 2 notes that I wrote. I wrote haunting, but weirdly upbeat, and that was what I thought about too. And the other thing that I love is, like, Neko Case's voice is so, specific to me, and it sounds of a certain time and place, and so I like that you kind of got that, like, you got sort of that feel for time and place in the song as well, and again, I think that's just through her voice or me knowing who she is, but I don't know, it made the song kind of hit home a little bit more, knowing like, oh, she's from around this area and now singing about this. It makes sense to me that she's sort of like time stamped this event, in her own way, with her own artistic bent to it. So I did like that about the song. And then, yeah, like I'd heard the song before and didn't know what it was about. And so like when it popped up on this list, I was like, wait a minute, that's a murder song? Huh. Okay. So yeah, it was one of those where I was surprised by what it was I had been singing to, or, I thought it was something completely different than what it actually was.
Yeah, we'll get to some songs this season that are much more specific as to the references they make. But I think in this case, yeah, you're right. Like if you don't know the story and you don't know the context behind it, it doesn't directly put you there to think, okay, this is a song about a serial killer.
Yeah. I mean, there's no, and he, even talking about like he picked on the vulnerable or whatever, you know what I mean? It doesn't, you really do have to know kind of the backstory to know what this is about. So I like that. I like that it's like a little more veiled than some of the other overt references. I mean, you can't get around a song called Shankill Butchers. Like, that's probably not a love song.
Probably not. Probably not. No, but yeah, you're exactly right. It's you would not have known it. Just based on title for sure, let alone if you're just hearing it for the first time. So, all right, well, let's try to advance one of these songs, Jen. I mean, I think just based on, what say you, as far as just based on the sound of the song, which one would you favor out of these two?
Out of these 2, I think I'm gonna go with the Neko Case song. I think that it's just, again, that haunting yet upbeat section. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, like, that must have really been what her childhood felt like growing up during this time, right? Like, that it feels very somber or very haunting, and then you're a kid, so you're playing, you're having fun, and then that thought creeps in, or it starts to get dark, and you hear your mom say, I need you to come home before the street lights come on, or whatever
Hmm.
the case was, back in the day when we were kids. And so I feel like that, for me, it's the Neko Case song. And I feel like I was also surprised, right? Like that one wasn't so overt about its intent, that it gave me a little bit more to dig into. So sadly, I'm not going to take the song about the troubles, my people. But I really I like what Neko Case did with her song. So for me, it's the Neko Case song.
Yeah, I would tend to agree listening to both songs. And I don't think I actually like both songs, but I just think Nico Case was a little more nuanced in the presentation here, just from a song standpoint. And then to take it a step further, I would say is, kind of our next category being, how it sort of relates to the crime or criminal. I just think this sort of it's so much more personal with Neko case, whereas the Decemberists are likely writing about stories they've heard or read.
Agreed. It does feel a little bit removed. It feels more of like a historic retelling versus like a lived experience.
Okay, so we're going to advance deep red bells in our first matchup here, advancing into the finals of the serial killer division. So you're going to get to learn a little bit more about the Green River Killer story as we advance that story into the second round. And then we're going to add some bonus content to expound on the Shankill Butcher's story as well. So there you have it, our first round in the true crime song battle. This is season 2 of the battle. And so join us again next week where we will have yet another matchup in the serial killer division. This time it will be Leeds United by Luke Haynes taking on Suffer Little Children by the Smiths. So join us then and learn a little bit more about some of maybe your favorite true crime, but something maybe all new when it comes to the genre of true crime. So for Jenn, this is Matt, and we'll see you then.